If you were listening this morning to our first reading from Psalm 6, and if you are aware that this is Trinity Sunday, you might have wondered what on earth Psalm 6 has to do or could possibly have to do with Trinity Sunday, the Sunday on which we are instructed to delve into the mystery of the Christian revelation of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. And the answer to the question, what does that have to do with Psalm 6, or what does Psalm 6 have to do with the Trinity, is absolutely nothing. It's completely arbitrary. And that's why we brought in Bruno this morning to do the heavy theological lifting and get the Trinity out of the way so that we could move on to the much easier and much lighter and much more cheerful and uplifting words of the psalmist in Psalm 6, which just happens to be where we are in terms of our psalm readings on Thursday mornings. And so that's what we get to have this morning. But if you listen to those words, it might have occurred to you that perhaps Psalm 6 is not quite as cheery and uplifting as we might have hoped. And it's puzzling to figure out exactly what it is that's going on here in this poem. What is the poet going through? What is the poet feeling? What is going on in the poet's heart? So you'll be glad to know that on Thursday, this past Thursday, the group of us who gather to share together about the coming Sunday's reading of Psalms has worked hard and feverishly for a full hour trying to come to grips with the words of the poet in Psalm 6 and to try to really figure out what is going on with him and what is he really feeling. And so you'll be glad to know that after all of that wrestling, after that hour of struggling and studying these words, we came together to the momentous insight that when he wrote the words of Psalm 6, the poet was feeling unhappy. I am languishing. My bones are shaking with terror. My soul also is struck with terror. I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. My eyes waste away because of grief. The poet is not a happy person in Psalm 6. He is suffering, it would appear, some kind of grievous internal friction, pain, grief. And on Thursdays, we tried hard to figure out exactly what is going on that has caused him to be in such a state of grief. And it's not entirely clear from the psalm. It seems it may have something to do with enemies, opposition that he's experiencing. There's some speculation that, in fact, he's grievously ill, maybe even on his deathbed. But you can't really figure out exactly what's going on that has caused the psalmist to feel such deep despair, to feel that he is languishing, shaking with terror, and stricken with fear. But I don't actually think that the circumstances of the psalmist's life are what is most important here. I think what's important, first of all, is to recognize that the psalmist, the poet, is deeply and powerfully honest about what he's feeling. He doesn't hold back. I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. My eyes waste away because of grief. He is in pain, and he does not pretend that he isn't. I think that's important for us. I think that we need to understand that being a person of faith, being a person who trusts in God, which the psalmist certainly and clearly did, being a person of faith does not mean going through life with a plastic smile pasted on the front of your face. Being a person of faith means fundamentally, before anything else, being a person who is honest, a person who is committed to the truth. Not so much the truth of dogma, not so much the truth of theology, which changes and comes and goes over the years, but the truth of yourself, the truth of your inner condition, your inner state, and acknowledges that. So we may not always respond to everyone, to the question, how are you? We may not always respond just with, oh, I'm fine, thank you. How about you? There may be days when we actually need to respond with, I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. That may be the truth of our inner state at a given time. And that does not mean that we are not people of faith. It doesn't mean we've given up on God. It simply means that our internal state, reflecting perhaps whatever circumstances are going on outside in our lives, or maybe even no circumstances, just a feeling, just an instinct, just something that is churning inside, that is our condition. And we need to listen to that in ourselves. And we need to be willing to listen to that in one another. I'm wearing my orange shirt today and the beautiful stole that Shannon made, and it's not because it's Orange Shirt Day, which doesn't come until September. It's because of the horrifying news out of Kamloops this past week. 215 children, their bodies uncovered in the yard of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Children who died innocent. Children who died through no fault of their own. And you have to ask yourself, how would our history be different if, when our forebears came to this land, instead of coming with all of their answers and all of their power and all of their wisdom, they came to the people who lived here already and said, tell us who you are. Tell us how your lives work. Tell us about your culture. And if they came genuinely wanting to listen. But see, the problem with listening is that we may not always hear what we want to hear. Sometimes we may hear that someone is drenching their couch with weeping. Sometimes we may hear that a person's eyes are wasting away because of grief, and that may be hard to hear. That may be hard to bear. And so in an attempt to protect ourselves from that which we don't want to hear, we just shut it out and we close down. We put up our defenses, and we keep everyone at a distance for fear that their pain may impact us, or that they may perceive our pain, and perceiving our pain may fear that they see us as weak or frail. I read a quote from Anne Lamott, who is quoting a comedian friend of hers, who said, "You know, what people need to understand is that when they first meet me, they're meeting my bodyguard." I thought that was such a great comment. We can come into life determined to be not like the psalmist, but approaching the world with our bodyguard firmly in place. The psalmist doesn't have a bodyguard. He's honest. He's upfront. We may not subscribe to all of the reasons he gives for his grief. He seems to have a terrible penchant for enemy formation, for seeing enemies outside of himself everywhere he looks. And maybe that was true, and maybe that was causing him grief. I don't think we need to go with the psalmist to the place where we identify enemies all around us. There may be things that cause us to struggle. There may be things that feel harsh and painful and difficult. I'm sure if you spent the early years of your childhood in an Indian residential school, you might well have felt that you were indeed surrounded by enemies. But in the end, what you needed to do was be honest with yourself. And what we all need to do is be honest with ourselves and acknowledge our condition and acknowledge the reality of our inner state. And the thing I think that makes it possible for the psalmist to do that is that at the very heart of his being, in the deepest, innermost sanctuary of his being, he knows something. In verse 4 of this Psalm 6, the psalmist says to God, "Turn, O Lord, save my life." So the first thing he knows is that he knows he can't fix the problem himself. He knows that he can't just pick himself up, brush himself off, and carry on with a cheery smile on his face. He knows that he needs help. And it requires humility to acknowledge that we need help. In AA, the whole process only begins when the alcoholic acknowledges that they have become powerless over alcohol in their lives, and they reach out to a power higher than themselves for help. The psalmist always knew, always trusted that help was there. And so he prays, "Turn, O Lord, save my life." And save my life, the word, we get sort of messed around with this word save and salvation, because we think of it as just fixing our circumstances, or even worse, we think of it as saving us from some kind of eternal, horrifying destiny that awaits us after death. But the word saves the same, it's a Latin root of salve. Salvation is salving, it's healing, it's bringing that peace which we sang about earlier. It's bringing wholeness. It's making it possible for us to live as integrated beings, as whole people. It's the ability to live beyond the fragmentation of enemy formation and to find a deeper reality in ourselves. And that's the place ultimately where the psalmist finds his salvation. He says, "Turn, O Lord, save my life." And then he says, "Deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love." Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, "Deliver me because I'm such a fine and worthy person." He doesn't say, deliver me because I've made a great financial contribution to the poor. He doesn't say, deliver me because I've worked so hard to do the right thing, and I am a righteous, law-abiding citizen. He knows that his healing, that his salvation, that his saving is not anything that he earns by his own merit. And so he prays, deliver me for the sake of your steadfast love. He understands that his salvation comes from the nature, the character, the person of God. And the fundamental nature the word occurs over 200 times just in the Psalms. That is translated in the NRSV as steadfast love. The word is hesed. It's often translated as mercy, but I think steadfast love is a beautiful translation of this quality of God, this fundamental character of God's nature is that God is the reliable, steady heartbeat of the universe. God is faithful. The power of life does not betray us. The reason we are able to live with our pain, the reason we are able to be truthful and honest and to hear and bear other people's pain is because we know ultimately that languishing and shaking and terror and moaning and tears and weeping and grief are not the ultimate reality in life. There is always something beneath that or alongside that which causes us pain. There is always that steady, enduring, reliable energy field of love that is God's nature, bearing us up, holding us, caring for us, and enabling us to have our hearts open to the pain of others. And that's the challenge, that's the challenge in horrific news. We hear such horrifying things in the news all the time. Certainly the Kamloops residential school is up there with the most painful and difficult realities that we have had to confront in our past, in our history, not very long ago. And without the steadfast love, without the mercy of God that is never changing, it's impossible to look with honesty at the reality of the human condition. It's impossible to bear truthfully the extraordinary, fractured reality of human circumstance. It's impossible to see and bear truthfully our own pain, let alone the pain of those closest and dearest to us, let alone the pain of the wider world and the horror that we see every day on the news. But if we can find within ourselves that steady ground, that abiding reality that is God's nature at the heart of our being, then all things become bearable. And when all things become bearable, we can afford to let down our bodyguard. We can afford to open to that deeper place within ourselves where we discover a beauty and a truth and a strength, which we then are able to make available to other people. And we can become in their lives a witness to that steadfast love and mercy that we see in Jesus and that we understand to be the true and fundamental nature of the person of God.